There is a particular kind of clock that governs the most dangerous moments in geopolitics. It is the clock without hands, the one that everyone in the room knows is running, that everyone can feel counting down, but that nobody can read directly because the moment it hits zero is not determined by a number. It is determined by a decision, and the decision has not yet been made. Tonight, that clock is running on two simultaneous tracks: a ceasefire that expires in hours, and a peace process in Islamabad that Iran never showed up to. The question that the mechanics of this crisis turn on is not whether the clock is running. It is whether the Omani back channel, the only real diplomatic track left, is moving fast enough to stop it before someone decides for it. Here is the paradox that the systemic story of this moment produces. The most important diplomatic conversation happening right now is the one you cannot see.
Not the empty chairs in Pakistan, not the statement from Tehran's foreign ministry, not the U.S. naval posture communiques. The conversation that matters is happening in Muscat, in a building you will never see on television, between interlocutors who will never be named in a press release. And whether that conversation is producing something is going to determine what the next 48 hours look like more definitively than anything happening in any of the visible diplomatic theaters. To understand how a crisis tips from managed to unmanaged, you need to trace the cause and effect chains that run through it simultaneously, not one at a time, but together, because it is the interaction between them that produces the tipping. Tonight, I want to trace 4 of those chains and show you exactly where they are intersecting and what that intersection tells us about whether we are watching a system hold or a system break. I study how crises cascade, how a system under pressure moves from a state of managed tension, where multiple parties are holding contradictory positions simultaneously without the contradictions forcing a resolution, to a state of unmanaged crisis, where the contradictions force themselves into the open faster than the system can absorb them. What the historical record shows is that the transition between those two states is almost never caused by a single dramatic action. It is caused by the simultaneous failure of multiple stabilizing mechanisms, each one individually manageable but collectively overwhelming. Tonight, at least 3 of those mechanisms are under simultaneous stress. Let me show you which ones. One sentence. The expiring ceasefire and the empty chair in Pakistan are not 2 separate crises. They are 2 simultaneous failures of stabilizing mechanisms in the same system, and the Omani back channel is the only remaining mechanism that can absorb both failures before their interaction produces an outcome that none of the parties has actually chosen. Start with the first cause and effect chain, the ceasefire expiration itself. A ceasefire is not just a pause in hostilities. It is a stabilizing mechanism that changes the operational calculus of every military commander in the theater. While the ceasefire holds, military commanders on both sides are operating under rules of engagement that constrain their response to provocations. Because responding to a provocation during a ceasefire requires accepting the political cost of being identified as the party that broke it. The moment a ceasefire expires, that constraint disappears. Commanders revert to standard rules of engagement. And standard rules of engagement in a high-tension environment mean that an action that would have been absorbed during the ceasefire, a vessel straying into contested waters, a drone flying an ambiguous course, a communication misread at the operational level, becomes the trigger for a response that escalates before civilian leadership is even informed. The historical record of ceasefire expiration events is instructive here. The 1973 Yom Kippur War began with an Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal ceasefire line that was initially assessed by Israeli intelligence as a routine patrol escalation rather than a full offensive. The difference between that assessment and the reality took 6 hours to resolve. 6 hours in which the operational situation on the ground moved faster than the intelligence analysis feeding the political leadership. Tonight's ceasefire expiration does not produce that specific scenario, but it produces the same category of risk. A theater in which the gap between operational reality and political leadership awareness widens precisely at the moment when that gap is most dangerous. Now trace the second chain, Iran's absence from Pakistan and what it signals to the Gulf states. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, have been watching the entire sequence of this crisis with an acuity that the Western coverage significantly underestimates. These are governments whose physical territory hosts U.S. military infrastructure, whose civilian populations live within range of Iranian missile systems, and whose economic infrastructure, oil terminals, desalination plants, airport hubs, is the most exposed non-military target set in any scenario of direct U.S.-Iran conflict. What the Gulf states read from Iran's absence in Pakistan is not the same thing the Western coverage reads. Western coverage reads it as Iranian intransigence or diplomatic posturing. The Gulf states read it as a signal about Iranian internal dynamics, specifically about whether the supreme leadership has lost sufficient control of the IRGC's operational planning that a military action could happen without the political leadership's deliberate authorization. That is the scenario that terrifies Gulf state capitals more than a deliberate Iranian attack. A deliberate attack can be calibrated, responded to proportionally, and managed through back channels. An attack that the Iranian political leadership did not fully authorize, an IRGC unit acting on its own operational assessment, cannot be managed the same way, because the back channel to the supreme leadership does not reach the commanders who pulled the trigger. Saudi Arabia has spent the past 72 hours in accelerated diplomatic contact with Washington, according to reporting from Reuters and the Financial Times. The content of those contacts, while not publicly disclosed, can be inferred from the pattern. Riyadh is asking for clarity on U.S. rules of engagement in the event of an Iranian strike on Saudi infrastructure, seeking assurances about the scope of the U.S. defensive commitment, and privately communicating its assessment that the ceasefire expiration tonight significantly raises the risk of exactly the kind of unauthorized or miscalculated IRGC action that Gulf state capitals most fear. The UAE has simultaneously accelerated its own back-channel contact with Iranian interlocutors, using the Abraham Accords normalization infrastructure, which created a direct UAE-Israel Gulf communication architecture that also has indirect channels to Tehran, to communicate that Abu Dhabi does not want to be caught in a conflict it did not choose and cannot absorb. Now trace the third chain, the Omani back channel and what it can and cannot do in the time available. Oman's value as a back channel facilitator derives from a specific set of structural features. It maintains formal diplomatic relations with Iran. It has historically been trusted by both Washington and Tehran as a neutral intermediary, and its foreign policy, anchored by decades of Sultan Qaboos's strategic neutrality and continued under his successor, gives it a credibility that no other Gulf state possesses for this particular function. The Omani Channel produced the secret talks that led to the 2013 Geneva Interim Agreement, which was the foundation of the JCPOA. It has been used for prisoner exchanges and signals communication at multiple points in the U.S.-Iran relationship. What the Omani Channel can do right now is transmit a specific kind of message, a private U.S. commitment about the non-repetition of the boarding operation combined with a private Iranian commitment about the form any retaliation will take, diplomatic, legal, economic rather than military. What it cannot do is produce that message if the political will to send it does not exist on the U.S. side. And the constraint on the U.S. side is not strategic. Washington understands perfectly well that a private commitment through Oman is cheaper than the alternative. The constraint is domestic political, making a private commitment that could later be characterized as a retreat under pressure from an adversary that just called the United States a pirate is a difficult position for any administration to occupy, regardless of its strategic merits. The fourth chain is the one that connects all the others, the domestic Iranian audience tonight. The supreme leadership faces a specific performance requirement in front of its own population that constrains its decision-making in ways the external analysis consistently underweights. The Islamic Republic's domestic legitimacy has never rested on economic performance. The sanctions have made that impossible. It has rested on a narrative of resistance to external pressure, on the proposition that Iran can be attacked and sanctioned and coerced and still refuse to yield. That narrative is the regime's core product for its domestic audience. And tonight, with a ceasefire expiring and no Iranian delegation in Pakistan, that audience is watching to see whether the narrative holds. The supreme leadership does not need to launch a military attack to satisfy its domestic audience. What it needs is to demonstrate that the response to the marine boarding operation was not absorption, was not, in the language of Iranian political culture, surrender. The piracy framing is part of that demonstration. The refusal to attend Pakistan's talks is part of that demonstration. A symbolic but direct military action, calibrated to produce visible impact without triggering full-scale retaliation, would complete that demonstration. And the Omani back channel, if it is working, needs to offer something that allows the supreme leadership to satisfy the domestic performance requirement without crossing the military threshold. What that something looks like is the precise question that the back channel is, right now, trying to answer. Here is where the cause and effect chains interact in the way that produces the tipping risk. The ceasefire expires tonight, removing the operational constraint on military commanders. The Gulf states accelerated diplomatic contact signals that they assess the risk of an unauthorized IRGC action as elevated. The Omani back channel is operating under a time pressure that it was not designed for. It was built for patient, deniable, weeks-long diplomacy, and tonight it has hours. And the domestic Iranian audience is watching a leadership that has committed publicly to a piracy framing and a refusal to negotiate, which means the back channel solution needs to be invisible, cannot be seen as a retreat, or it does not solve the domestic performance problem even if it resolves the military one. That interaction, operational freedom restored, Gulf state alarm elevated, back channel time compressed, domestic performance requirements constraining the solution space, is the system configuration that produces unmanaged crises. Not because anyone wants an unmanaged crisis, because the stabilizing mechanisms are simultaneously under stress in ways that prevent any single one of them from absorbing the pressure that would otherwise flow to the others. The historical comparative that is most instructive here is not 1988 or 1973. It is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, specifically, the 13 days between the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba and the resolution that removed them. What the declassified record of those 13 days shows is that the resolution was not produced by the official diplomatic exchanges between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It was produced by a back channel, the ABC News correspondent John Scully acting as an informal intermediary, the Soviet intelligence officer Alexander Fomin conveying terms that the official channel could not carry without creating political problems for either leader. The official channel was theater. The back channel was the mechanism. And the back channel worked because both sides were simultaneously terrified enough of the alternative and flexible enough about the form of the solution to accept terms that neither could have publicly endorsed. The Omani back channel is Oman's version of the Scully-Fomin connection. It carries terms that neither the US nor Iran can publicly endorse without political cost. Its value is precisely its invisibility. And tonight, it is operating under time pressure that the Cuban Missile Crisis back channel did not face, in an environment where the domestic performance requirements on the Iranian side are more constraining than Khrushchev's were, and where the U.S. domestic political environment is less flexible than Kennedy's was. Now look at how the Gulf states are actually repositioning, because this is the angle the coverage is not connecting. Saudi Arabia's acceleration of diplomatic contact with Washington is not just about seeking assurances. It is about positioning. Riyadh is communicating its own red lines to Washington. What kinds of Iranian action against Saudi infrastructure it would require a U.S. military response to, and what kinds it could absorb without triggering that requirement. That communication is itself a form of deterrence management. Saudi Arabia is telling Washington what it needs to hear to stay calm, while simultaneously telling Tehran indirectly, through the UAE's back channel, what kinds of action would cross Saudi red lines and force Riyadh to invoke the U.S. security commitment. The UAE's dual-track positioning is the most sophisticated in the Gulf right now. Abu Dhabi is simultaneously maintaining its Abraham Accords relationship with Israel, which gives it access to Israeli intelligence assessments of Iranian military readiness, while using its Iranian back channel to communicate that the UAE does not want to be a target and has no interest in the conflict escalating. The UAE is, in effect, playing both sides of the intelligence and signaling architecture simultaneously, which is only possible because the Abraham Accords created a communication infrastructure that Abu Dhabi can use without either Washington or Tehran being able to fully read what is passing through it. Kuwait and Bahrain, the two Gulf states with the most direct U.S. military infrastructure exposure, have moved into a posture of deliberate diplomatic quietude. Neither has made public statements about the crisis. Neither has publicly invoked its U.S. defense commitments. The quietude is not indifference. It is calculated. Both governments understand that public statements increase their visibility as potential targets and reduce their flexibility as potential back-channel facilitators. The silence is itself a diplomatic signal to Tehran that Kuwait and Bahrain are not part of any operational planning against Iran, to Washington that they need the crisis to de-escalate before they are forced into a public position they cannot sustain. Every actor in this architecture is caught between the clock they can feel and the clock they cannot read. The ceasefire expires at a known time. The Omani back channel's progress is unknown. The IRGC's operational readiness is assessed but not confirmed. The domestic Iranian audience's tolerance for a non-military response has a threshold that the supreme leadership is estimating rather than measuring. And the U.S. domestic political environment's tolerance for a private assurance through Oman, for a solution that looks like de-escalation rather than victory, is being tested in real time by advisors whose political instincts may or may not align with the strategic logic. The mechanics of how a crisis tips from managed to unmanaged are not mysterious once you can see the interacting chains. The system tips when the stabilizing mechanisms fail simultaneously rather than sequentially, when there is no single remaining mechanism capable of absorbing the pressure that would otherwise flow to military action. Tonight, the ceasefire expiration removes one stabilizing mechanism. The empty chair in Pakistan confirms that another is not functional. The Omani back channel is the last one standing. And it is operating under time pressure in an invisible space, against a domestic performance requirement on the Iranian side that constrains the solution it can offer. That is the mechanical description of where we are. It is not a prediction of war. It is a description of a system under simultaneous stress, with one remaining stabilizing mechanism, operating in its most constrained conditions. The system has been here before, not identically, but structurally, and it has not always tipped. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolved. The 1973 ceasefire eventually held. The Oman Channel worked in 2013. The precedent for the back channel working under pressure exists. What is different tonight is the number of simultaneous stresses and the compressed time frame. And that difference is what makes the next 48 hours the most consequential window in this crisis so far. I want to leave you with the specific variable I will be watching tonight and tomorrow morning, because it is not the one the coverage will focus on. It is not whether Iran launches a military action. It is whether the Gulf states' diplomatic posture shifts from calculated quietude to active public statement. If Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Kuwait issues a public statement about the crisis in the next 24 hours, especially one that calls for restraint or dialogue, it means their back-channel assessments are telling them that the Omani track is not moving fast enough. Public statements from Gulf states in a crisis of this kind are not commentary. They are distress signals sent in diplomatic language to the parties whose back-channel they cannot reach directly. Watch for them. If you see one, the clock without hands just got a little louder. Here is the question I want you to sit with. In the mechanics of crisis tipping that we just traced, the simultaneous failure of stabilizing mechanisms, the invisible back-channel under time pressure, the domestic performance requirement that constrains the solution space, which single mechanism, if it were functioning properly, would be most capable of absorbing all the pressure before the system tips? What would it take to make that mechanism work? Leave your answer in the comments. The most mechanically precise responses I will read in the follow-up.